Angela Parker had spent years navigating the tense and challenging corridors of St. Mary's General Hospital. As a dedicated nurse, she had witnessed moments of both profound triumph and heartbreaking failure, but nothing could have prepared her for the day everything changed. It began like any other shift. Angela, with her sharp focus and warm demeanor, was making her rounds when she was abruptly called to assist in the emergency department. A patient had been rushed in after a severe skiing accident, and the injuries required immediate attention. The patient, Thomas Edwards, was unconscious but stable. As Angela worked alongside the team, she couldn't help but notice Dr. William Greaves, one of the hospital's senior surgeons, treating her with his usual dismissive tone. It was nothing new. Over the years, Angela had grown accustomed to Dr. Greaves' condescending remarks and blatant favoritism toward certain staff members. But today was different. Thomas Edwards regained consciousness later that evening. Angela entered his room to check his vitals, her usual professionalism masking the weariness of a long day. To her surprise, Mr. Edwards engaged her in conversation, asking about her experience at St. Mary's. Reluctant at first, Angela eventually opened up about the challenges she faced. The systemic bias, the lack of support, and the culture of silence that permeated the hospital. "It sounds like you've been fighting an uphill battle," Mr. Edwards said, his piercing gaze hinting at thoughts he chose not to voice. Angela nodded, unsure why she felt compelled to share so much with a stranger. Little did she know this patient was no ordinary man. The following day, the tension in the hospital reached a boiling point. Angela was assisting with a complicated procedure when Dr. Greaves openly criticized her in front of the entire surgical team. His words were biting, his tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe if you paid more attention, Nurse Parker, we wouldn't have these delays," he snapped. Angela's face burned with humiliation, but she kept her composure. Later, as she recounted the incident to a colleague, she overheard whispers that Mr. Edwards had witnessed the exchange. That evening, Angela was summoned to a meeting with the hospital administrator. To her shock, Mr. Edwards was present. Seated in a wheelchair, his authoritative presence filled the room. "Mr. Edwards has some concerns about the culture here at St. Mary's," the administrator began, clearly uncomfortable. Thomas Edwards wasted no time. "I've observed a troubling pattern during my stay here," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The treatment of Nurse Parker today was not an isolated incident. This hospital has a systemic problem, and it needs to be addressed." Angela sat frozen, her mind racing. Who was this man to speak with such authority? As if reading her thoughts, the administrator added hesitantly, "Mr. Edwards is the CEO of Healthcare United." The revelation hit Angela like a thunderclap. Healthcare United was one of the largest healthcare networks in the country. Mr. Edwards wasn't just a patient. He was someone who could enact real change. Over the next few hours, Mr. Edwards laid out his demands. He called for a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a revamp of hiring and promotion protocols. He made it clear that Dr. Greaves' behavior would not go unchecked. "This isn't just about moral obligation," he said, his voice unwavering. "It's about patient care. A toxic work environment compromises everyone's safety." Word spread quickly through the hospital. Staff members whispered in break rooms and corridors, speculating about the changes to come. Some were supportive, others defensive. For Angela, the shift was surreal. Colleagues who had previously dismissed her now approached her with apologies and tentative offers of support. The following morning, an emergency meeting was called. The hospital's auditorium buzzed with tension as staff filled the seats. Angela sat near the back, her heart pounding. At the front of the room, Mr. Edwards stood tall despite his injuries, flanked by the hospital's leadership team. "Good morning," he began, his voice commanding attention. "For those who don't know me, I am Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I've observed behaviors and practices here that are deeply troubling. Discrimination, bias, and unprofessional conduct have no place in healthcare." The room fell silent as he continued, outlining the immediate changes he was implementing. Dr. Greaves, he announced, had been suspended pending a full investigation. Diversity and inclusion training would be mandatory, and a new chief diversity officer would be appointed. "I'm pleased to announce that Nurse Angela Parker has agreed to take on this role," Mr. Edwards said, his words met with a ripple of applause. Angela froze, stunned by the announcement. She had only agreed to join the diversity committee, not lead it. But as Mr. Edwards gestured for her to join him at the podium, she knew this was her moment to rise. Taking a deep breath, Angela addressed the crowd. "I stand here not as an adversary but as a colleague. Together, we can create a hospital where everyone feels valued and every patient receives the best care, regardless of their background." Her words resonated, sparking a wave of cautious optimism. Over the following weeks, Angela worked tirelessly alongside Mr. Edwards and the hospital's leadership to implement the promised changes. The road was far from smooth. Resistance was strong, particularly from long-standing staff who resented the shift in power dynamics. But progress came in small, meaningful steps. Staff began attending the training sessions and the hiring processes became more transparent. Dr. Greaves' dismissal sent a clear message. Discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. Months later, St. Mary's General Hospital was almost unrecognizable. Angela, now a sought-after speaker on diversity in healthcare, reflected on the journey. Standing in the hospital's newly renovated lobby, she admired a mural that depicted a diverse team of healthcare workers. Below it, a plaque read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." As she turned to leave, Mr. Edwards approached her. Fully recovered, he extended a hand. "Angela," he said with a smile, "you've not only transformed this hospital but inspired a movement. Other facilities in our network are following your lead." Angela felt a surge of pride. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time she felt confident that change was possible. Together, she and Mr. Edwards had sparked a revolution, proving that one voice, when amplified, could make all the difference. As she walked out into the evening, Angela smiled. The work was far from over, but she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, this wasn't just about St. Mary's. It was about changing the very fabric of healthcare, one institution at a time. Angela Parker had spent the last decade of her life working at St. Mary's General Hospital, a place where the pulse of the city met the delicate heartbeat of healthcare. A nurse by profession, Angela had dedicated herself to providing the best care possible to her patients. She had witnessed life's most profound victories: the birth of new life, the relief of a patient recovering from surgery, and its deepest sorrows, the silent tears of families losing their loved ones, the heartache of those who couldn't be saved in time. But nothing could have prepared Angela for the fateful day when her entire world would shift. It began like any other shift. Angela's day was structured, methodical. She made her rounds, checking on patients, adjusting medications, offering comfort where it was needed most. Her colleagues knew her as dedicated, professional, and warm. Even the most difficult patients seemed to soften in her presence. But today there was a sense of tension in the air, a barely perceptible hum of something off. Angela couldn't place it at first, but the feeling grew as she moved through the halls of the hospital. She was called to the emergency department. A severe skiing accident had brought in a patient who needed immediate attention. His name was Thomas Edwards. The trauma team was already working on stabilizing him, but his injuries were severe. He was unconscious but stable, and the doctors and nurses around him moved with precision, their motions practiced and synchronized. Angela, though used to chaotic situations in the ER, couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. There was something unsettling about this case. As she worked alongside the team, her eyes occasionally drifted toward Dr. William Greaves, one of the senior surgeons in the hospital. Dr. Greaves had always been condescending toward her. Over the years, Angela had learned to ignore his biting remarks, his dismissive tone, the way he favored certain staff members and openly belittled others. She had learned to keep her head down, do her work, and avoid his scorn. But today it felt different. There was a coldness to his gaze that lingered longer than usual, and the tone of his words seemed sharper, more deliberate. Angela couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. Later that evening, as Angela was making her rounds again, She entered Thomas Edwards' room to check on his vitals. She had become accustomed to the routine, checking blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels, but this time something caught her off guard. Mr. Edwards was awake, his eyes fluttering open. He appeared confused at first, then as his gaze met hers, his expression softened. "Miss Parker," he said weakly, "how long have I been out?" Angela was taken aback. "A few hours," she replied, adjusting his foreline. "You were in a pretty serious accident. We've been monitoring you closely." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixing on her. "I can tell. Thank you for being here." Angela smiled politely. "It's my job," she said, though the words felt strangely hollow. There was something in the way he spoke, something in his demeanor that intrigued her. He didn't seem like an ordinary patient. There was an air of authority about him, a subtle confidence that made Angela pause. As she continued with her routine, Mr. Edwards spoke again. "You've been at this hospital for a while, haven't you?" Angela nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, about 10 years now. You must have seen a lot in that time. Both good and bad, I imagine." Angela hesitated. She had always been cautious about sharing personal thoughts with patients, but something about Mr. Edwards made her feel comfortable. She exhaled slowly. "There's been a lot of change, and not always for the better. There's a lot of talk about things improving, but the culture here, it's difficult. There's a lot of resistance to change." Mr. Edwards listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. "It sounds like you've been fighting an uphill battle," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of understanding that surprised Angela. She nodded, unsure why she was sharing so much with a stranger. "That's one way to put it. There's a lot of systemic issues, things that never seem to get addressed. And it's frustrating. It feels like we're stuck in a cycle, like nothing ever really changes." Mr. Edwards seemed to ponder her words for a moment, his eyes distant. "I think change is often uncomfortable," he said. "But it's necessary if we want things to improve." Angela wasn't sure why, but his words struck a chord with her. She had heard similar sentiments from colleagues, but there was something in his tone that made it feel different. It wasn't just talk, it felt like he believed it. "I'm not sure I'm the person to lead that change," Angela said, almost to herself. Mr. Edwards gave her a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps, but you've certainly seen enough to know what needs to be done." Angela didn't know what to make of the conversation. It was strange, almost surreal. Here she was, talking to a patient about the very issues that had been weighing on her for years. And yet, something told her that this man, Thomas Edwards, was no ordinary patient. There was something about him that felt different. Something powerful. The next day, the hospital was buzzing with tension. It started with a routine procedure, but soon escalated into a confrontation that would set the stage for everything that followed. Angela was assisting Dr. Greaves with a complicated surgery. The patient was stable, but the procedure was delicate. As usual, Dr. Greaves barked orders, and Angela followed them without hesitation. But when a minor mistake delayed the operation, the surgeon wasted no time in berating her in front of the entire surgical team. "Maybe if you paid more attention, Nurse Parker, we wouldn't have these delays," he snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. Angela's face burned with humiliation, and her hands shook slightly as she held the instruments. She had expected his criticism, but the public nature of it made it worse. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, judging her. But she didn't respond, didn't retaliate. She simply focused on the task at hand, her professionalism holding her steady. Later, as Angela recounted the incident to a colleague, she overheard whispers. Word had spread quickly, but there was something strange in the air that night. Some staff members whispered in support of her, others in defense of Dr. Greaves. But among them, Angela heard a familiar name, Thomas Edwards. It seemed Mr. Edwards had witnessed the exchange. That evening, Angela was called to a meeting with the hospital administrator, something that had never happened before. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she certainly didn't anticipate what awaited her in the conference room. When she arrived, she was shocked to see Thomas Edwards sitting at the table. He was in a wheelchair, his appearance commanding attention even in his injured state. There was a certain gravity to his presence, something that immediately put everyone else in the room on edge. The hospital administrator, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at Angela before speaking. "Nurse Parker, thank you for coming. We wanted to discuss some concerns that have been raised about the culture here at St. Mary's. Mr. Edwards has some thoughts he'd like to share." Angela's mind raced. She had no idea what Mr. Edwards could have to say, let alone why he was in the hospital administrator's office. She took a seat, unsure of what to expect. Thomas Edwards wasted no time. "I've observed a troubling pattern during my time here," he began, his voice calm but firm. "The treatment of Nurse Parker today was not an isolated incident. I've seen how staff members are treated, how the atmosphere here is one of fear and intimidation. It's not conducive to providing the best patient care. This hospital has a systemic problem, and it needs to be addressed." Angela's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea that Mr. Edwards had witnessed what had transpired earlier in the day, let alone that he would speak out on her behalf. His words echoed in the room, and Angela could barely believe what she was hearing. Here was a patient, someone who had just been through a traumatic experience, speaking up about the very issues that had plagued the hospital for years. The administrator seemed taken aback. "Mr. Edwards, I understand your concerns, but we've made efforts to address these issues internally." "Efforts?" Thomas Edwards interrupted, his voice growing more resolute. "What you've been doing is not enough. This isn't just about internal complaints or employee morale. This is about the safety of patients. A toxic work environment doesn't just hurt the staff, it directly impacts the care we provide." Angela sat frozen, unable to comprehend the full weight of what was unfolding. Who was this man to speak so authoritatively? What did he have to gain from stepping into the middle of something as complex as hospital politics? As if reading her thoughts, the administrator hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Edwards is the CEO of Healthcare United." The revelation hit Angela like a thunderclap. Healthcare United was one of the largest and most influential healthcare networks in the country. Mr. Edwards wasn't just some wealthy patient with influence. He was a key figure in the healthcare industry. A man who could bring real change, someone whose voice could not be easily ignored. Angela tried to process the information, her mind racing. She had no idea what to say or even if she could say anything at all. Thomas Edwards continued. "I'm not here to make empty promises. I've seen enough to know that real change is needed. I'm calling for a full investigation into the practices at this hospital, into the culture of bias, discrimination, and favoritism. This isn't just about Nurse Parker. This is about everyone here. The staff, the patients, the families. Everyone deserves better." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Angela was still reeling, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Could this be the moment things finally began to change? Mr. Edwards didn't stop there. "In addition to the investigation, I'm calling for mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff from the top down. It's time for a complete overhaul of how we approach hiring, promotion, and how we treat each other in this hospital." And as for Dr. Greaves, he paused, letting the silence settle in. "His behavior will not be tolerated. I'm calling for his suspension pending a full review of his actions." The administrator nodded slowly, though his face remained tight. "We will certainly look into these matters, Mr. Edwards. But I must admit, this will be a significant undertaking. Change of this magnitude doesn't happen overnight." Thomas Edwards fixed the administrator with a look that could have frozen fire. "Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. I'm not asking for it, I'm demanding it. And I'll make sure it happens." Word spread quickly throughout the hospital. Whispers in the break rooms, in the hallways, even in the elevators, carried the news of Mr. Edwards' intervention. For Angela, the news was surreal. She had always been a quiet observer of the hospital's many injustices, a silent witness to the systemic problems that plagued the institution. But now someone had taken notice. Someone powerful enough to make a difference had stepped forward on her behalf. The next day, a meeting was called and the hospital's auditorium was filled to capacity. The staff, who had always followed the unspoken rules of silence, now found themselves on edge. Angela sat toward the back, her nerves a tangled mess as she waited for the meeting to begin. The atmosphere was electric. Every eye in the room fixed on the front of the room, where Mr. Edwards stood, flanked by the hospital's leadership team. "Good morning," Mr. Edwards began, his voice calm yet commanding. "For those of you who don't know me, I am Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I've observed behaviors and practices here at St. Mary's that are deeply troubling. Discrimination, bias, and unprofessional conduct have no place in healthcare. The culture at this hospital is toxic, and it's time for that to change." His words reverberated through the room, and for the first time in years, Angela felt a sense of validation. This wasn't just about her. This was about everything she had fought against, everything she had tried to change. And now it seemed like the tide was finally turning. Mr. Edwards continued, outlining the immediate changes that would be implemented. Dr. Greaves would be suspended pending investigation, mandatory diversity and inclusion training would begin, and a new chief diversity officer would be appointed to lead the charge for systemic change. "But that's not all," Mr. Edwards added, pausing to look directly at Angela. "I'm pleased to announce that Nurse Angela Parker has agreed to take on this role." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't agreed to lead the diversity committee, only to join it. But as Mr. Edwards gestured for her to come forward, the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. Angela stood frozen as Mr. Edwards announced her role as the new Chief Diversity Officer. She hadn't expected it, not in the least. She had agreed to be part of the committee to help push for change, but leading it? That was an entirely different matter. Her heart raced as all eyes in the room turned to her. Some looked at her with support, others with skepticism, but Angela knew she couldn't turn back now. She took a deep breath and slowly walked to the podium, her mind swirling. The room was still and silent as she stood beside Mr. Edwards, who gave her an encouraging nod. It was her moment to speak, her moment to turn the tide of the hospital's long-standing issues. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength with each word. "I stand here today not as an adversary but as a colleague. I've spent years working alongside many of you, and while I've seen moments of incredible compassion and dedication, I've also witnessed the ways we've failed to truly embrace the values of equality and respect." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was silent, every ear attuned to what she was about to say next. Angela's voice grew steadier, fueled by a fire she hadn't known she had within her. "We are here to create a hospital where every person, every patient feels valued. Where the color of your skin, your background, your gender, or your beliefs don't determine your worth. It's time we stopped pretending that things were fine when we all knew they weren't. And it's time we started doing the hard work of making this hospital a place of healing for not just our patients, but for all of us." A ripple of applause broke out in the room, and Angela couldn't help but feel a wave of emotion wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. The weight of the hospital's injustices, the years of silence, had all been leading to this moment. It was more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for the patients, the staff, and for everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. Over the next several weeks, Angela worked tirelessly to implement the changes Mr. Edwards had promised. The road was far from easy. There was resistance, particularly from some of the older, more entrenched staff who were set in their ways and resented the new direction. But Angela was resolute. She knew that this was about more than just making cosmetic changes. It was about fundamentally transforming the culture of the hospital. The diversity and inclusion training sessions were grueling at times, and not everyone participated willingly. But Angela persisted, holding tough conversations, challenging her colleagues' preconceived notions, and pushing for accountability at every turn. It wasn't just about making people comfortable. It was about making them understand the systemic issues at play and why those issues had to be addressed head-on. Dr. Greaves' suspension, though controversial to some, became a symbol that the hospital was no longer willing to tolerate unprofessional or discriminatory behavior. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the surgeon's actions had been part of a much larger pattern, and his eventual dismissal sent a clear message to the entire hospital. No one was above the new standards. But the changes weren't just administrative. Angela began to see real shifts in the day-to-day interactions between staff members. Nurses and doctors who had once barely acknowledged each other's presence now began to engage in meaningful conversations. The whispers of support that Angela had overheard in the hallways began to grow louder, and a sense of camaraderie emerged among the staff. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the hospital was starting to function as a true community, working together for the good of their patients. Months later, the transformation at St. Mary's General Hospital was nothing short of remarkable. The once sterile, impersonal environment had blossomed into a space where diversity was celebrated, and inclusion was not just a buzzword but a daily practice. The hospital's new lobby featured a beautiful mural that depicted a diverse team of healthcare workers, each one contributing to the healing of others. Beneath the mural, a plaque read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." Angela stood in front of the mural, taking in the sight of the vibrant new atmosphere. It had been a long, challenging road, but she couldn't deny the pride swelling in her chest. She had been a part of something that had truly changed the face of healthcare at St. Mary's. It wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, but it was a start. And that was more than she had ever hoped for. Just as she turned to leave, she saw Thomas Edwards approaching. Fully recovered and standing tall, he gave her a smile that seemed to radiate approval. He extended his hand and Angela took it, feeling the strength of his presence. "Angela," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "You've not only transformed this hospital but you've inspired a movement. Other facilities in our network are following your lead. You've made a lasting impact and I couldn't be prouder." Angela felt a lump form in her throat as she shook his hand. This man, who had been a stranger just months ago, had become an ally. A powerful ally who had believed in her when she had doubts about herself. "It's not just me," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's all of us. We're all in this together." As she walked out into the evening, her heart lightened with the knowledge that the journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. After all, the road to real change was never easy, but with each step forward she had seen that it was possible. And together they had sparked a revolution. One that would ripple through the very fabric of healthcare, changing it for the better, one institution at a time.